Hello, good listeners, and welcome to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives. We're here with another story about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dyck. Before we get into this week's story, I need to warn listeners that this episode contains descriptions of violence. Our story this week is about one of the earliest recorded school shootings in Canada, which took place in Altona, Manitoba in 1902. The shooter in this case was the school's teacher, Heinrich J. Toews. We're going to take a close look at Heinrich Toews' personality, and in an upcoming episode, get a better sense of the victims of this terrible tragedy. But first, let's look at what happened. On October 9th, 1902, in the old Altona village, Manitoba, Heinrich Toews arrived at the one-room school where he was a teacher. Outside the school, he spoke with two school trustees, Abram Rempel and John Hebert, who had scheduled a meeting with him to discuss some problems. It was a shock to both trustees when Toews pulled out a revolver. He shot Rempel in the hip and Hebert in the shoulder. A third trustee, Peter Kaler, got a bullet in the hand when he arrived on the scene. As the victims fled, Toews kept firing at them, but all three escaped. He then went into the school and shot three little girls, Susanna Rempel and Helena Kaler, both 10 years old, and Helena's younger sister Annie, who was 8. They were the daughters of the two trustees, Rempel and Kaler. Susanna and Helena survived, but Annie died of her injuries the following day. Toews ran north towards the new town of Altona with the gun still in his hand. When a man he knew approached him, Toews shot himself in the head. He lost an eye, but the bullet missed his brain. He was taken into custody, where he died 3 months later. The story was widely reported and highly sensationalized in the German-language newspaper Der Nordwestern, and in English in the Manitoba Free Press and the Winnipeg Daily Tribune. The Tribune described Toews as, quote, a death-dealing demon, unquote. But the papers also tried to make sense of the tragedy. Reporters interviewed many community members about Toews. The Manitoba Free Press said that Toews has always been considered as mentally deranged. The Winnipeg Daily Tribune wrote that Toews was very popular in Altona, both with the people and the pupils, although of late he had become morose and sullen. And according to Der Nordwestern, Toews was well liked by pupils and parents. Heinrich Toews was born in Yekaterinoslav, Imperial Russia, in 1866. His father died when he was a child, and his mother remarried. Toews and his family came to Canada when he was still a child, and he grew up in Rhineland, Manitoba. Toews taught in nearby New Hoffnung for several years before starting in the old Altona village school in 1899. Despite there being a teacher's residence on the property, Toews set up his bed beside his desk in the classroom and slept there. He ate his meals at the home of Abram and Helena Rempel, who lived across the road from the school. Abram was one of the school trustees that Toews would shoot in 1902. Around Christmas time in 1899, Toews left Altona without telling anyone. The school trustees were at a loss until they received a letter from Toews dated February 9, 1900, notifying them of his immediate resignation. The letter was written from Minneapolis. It was accompanied by a doctor's note explaining that Toews was unable to return to work because he was receiving medical treatment for a complication of ailments, and especially partial paralysis. The note shed little light on what Toews was suffering from. It was sent from the State Electromedical Institute in Minneapolis, whose letterhead advertises combined treatment of the great curative powers of medicine and electricity. When receiving treatment in Minneapolis, he wrote a letter to his friend Jacob Braun. This letter doesn't offer any clarity on Toews' treatment, but he does describe his state of mind at length. It's clear he was suffering great mental turmoil. For example, he writes, "My life's ship is in the darkest spiritual night, tossed about by storms and weather and floating dangerously toward the rapids." He describes his heart as unspeakably desolate and empty and cold and sad. Toews also felt hopeless about his career. He writes that he spent hundreds of dollars to train as a teacher, but that his studies failed utterly, suggesting that he tried and failed to become a certified teacher. Certification would have allowed him to teach in public schools, which paid better. But Toews only had a permit and was restricted to lower-paying schools outside of the public system. He seems bitter about not only his low salary, but also the cost of his medical treatment. He writes that his money has been taken by doctors without ever curing me. His self-hatred comes across clearly. I like nothing less in the world more than teaching school, he writes, but continues, it seems I am incompetent. Later in the letter he says, my good reputation, my fortune, my character, and my health lie buried in ruins, and nothing more is left in me to be spoiled. Oh, I wish to be forgotten by all Altona people forever, and to be erased from their memory, as if removed from the face of the earth. We don't know when Toews left Minneapolis and returned to Manitoba. Der Nordwestern reported that he taught in nearby Weidenfeld, Manitoba, for the 1900-1901 school year. He returned to Altona in the fall of 1901, but he again left in the summer of 1902. We have a good idea of what Toews got up to that summer because he wrote travelogues that were published in Der Nordwestern. Reading his travelogues, it's clear that Toews found joy in traveling. Toews went first to St. Paul, Minnesota, where he attended a National Education Association conference. From there, he traveled to Chicago. It seems he had a love for numbers. For example, he writes, Chicago has 78 fire engines that attend an average of 25 fires per day. The more than 1.5 million citizens of Chicago are protected by 3,500 police who arrest 90,000 persons each year and who in turn pay fines of $500,000. Toews also loved taking behind-the-scenes tours in places like stores, factories, and hotels. It seems that he had been to Chicago 2 years previously, but had been denied entry at several factories. This time, he came with reference letters from School Inspector H. H. Ewart, a certain F. F. Siemens, and Reeve Bergman. On the strength of these references, he gained access to guided factory tours, and at one factory, a lunch with senior management. Toews left Chicago for Battle Creek, Michigan, where he stayed at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. He writes, It's good to be here. Treatment is wonderful since these people do not believe in medicine and do not give it to any patients. He describes his daily routine at the sanitarium. Everyone is served a vegetarian diet with lots of water. Each day is started with a bath and physical exercise. Toews does not, however, say what he was seeking treatment for. He does note an ailing stomach in his travelogue, and the Manitoba Free Press reported that he was treated for dyspepsia, also known as indigestion. Toews interrupted his stay at the sanitarium for a 12-day trip to see Niagara Falls and New York City. He again took great pleasure in reporting all sorts of statistics in New York, and he was very interested in visiting the wealthiest parts of the city. The Altona School District eventually reached Toews at the sanitarium that summer, and he returned to Altona for the start of the 1902 school year. Margaret Lowenreimer, granddaughter of student and shooting victim Susanna Rempel, published an article about the shooting in 2011. She writes that when Toews returned, tensions grew. He continued taking his meals at the Rempel household, but became moody and difficult to please. Susanna, who was 10 years old at the time, recalled one instance when, after her mother reprimanded Toews for his behavior, he stormed out of the house and slammed the door so hard that the dishes rattled on the table. After that incident, Helena Rempel refused to let Toews join them for meals. Toews asked to board with trustee Peter Kaler, but was refused and was forced to take his meals at a hotel in New Altona. Toews' bitterness about these rejections found its way into the classroom. The trustees' daughters, Susanna, Helena, and Annie, bore the brunt of Toews' anger. Both Der Nordwestern and the Manitoba Free Press reported that the last words of Annie Kaler, the single fatality who was only 8 years old, were pleading with her teacher to be kind to her. Der Nordwestern reported that Toews had previously abused the trustees' children, which is what led the trustees to confront Toews on October 9th, 1902. We'll share more about those details in an upcoming episode. Abram Rempel and Peter Kaler tried to speak with Toews about the abuse earlier in the day, but got nowhere. They returned in the afternoon with trustee John Hebert and were greeted with Toews and his gun. After he was taken into custody, Toews spent some time at a hospital in Winnipeg before being moved to a prison. He died in January of 1903 from complications arising from the bullet wound in his head. After the shooting, newspapers reported that despite his head wound, Toews was lucid and could hold a conversation, but he refused to speak of the shooting. But Toews' brother, Bernhard, wrote a very different account of the aftermath. Bernhard's account is extremely sympathetic to Toews. According to him, Toews felt he had either gone insane or been taken over by evil. He claimed not to remember committing the crime and begged forgiveness from his mother, the victims' families, and God. He asked Bernhard multiple times to visit the girl's mother on his behalf to ask forgiveness. Bernhard doesn't say whether he actually tried to do so. Although Bernhard's sympathy for his brother is understandable, the inquest determined that the shooting had been deliberate, not an act of insanity. The Manitoba Free Press reported that Toews had written to a business in Winnipeg to order more guns, suggesting premeditation. A story republished in Preservings magazine indicates Toews did show remorse for his crime. The article quotes Toews this way, "Oh God, be merciful to me, a poor sinner. The pain in my head is great, but the agony of my soul is even greater." He apparently asked his brother to petition the bishops of the Sommerfeld and Bergtaler churches to have their congregations pray for him. By the end of December, Toews was thin and frail. Bernhard wrote that he was unable to eat anything but milk, water, and the occasional orange. He died on January 19, 1903. According to Bernhard, he was buried in the Weidenfeld Cemetery with a sermon about evil and forgiveness given by Elder Abram Dirksen. Margaret Lowen Reimer later wrote that she visited the cemetery and couldn't find Toews' headstone, speculating that as a murderer and attempted suicide, he may have been buried outside the cemetery. Documents related to Heinrich Toews and the Altona school shooting are held at the Mennonite Heritage Archives in Winnipeg. To see some related photos online or to hear this episode again, visit mharchives.ca. If you have questions or comments about this program, email us at info@mharchives.ca. In an upcoming episode, we'll share the few details we could find on the lasting effects of the trauma Susanna Rempel suffered. I'll also speak with her grandson, Ken Lowen, as he recounts the story written by his sister, the late Margaret Lowen Reimer.
3 shots fired at little Annie Kaler are the ones that proved fatal. She was 8 years old. She died the next day.
And Susanna's great-granddaughter, Gina Lowen, will read a summarized version of a poem written to commemorate the tragedy. Be sure to tune in again.
Hello, I'm Heinrich J, the archivist at the Mennonite Heritage Archives. Your donations help preserve and share stories like the one you just heard. To send a gift, visit our website at mharchives.ca and click on Support, or give us a call at 204-560-1998. Thanks also to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Mennonite Church Canada, and Golden West Radio.
Today's story was researched by Kaylee Dyck and Conrad Stace and written by Kaylee Dyck. I'm your host, Dan Dyck. Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will be back next week with more stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. Thanks for listening.